Illinois Forage and Grassland Council, supporting the production, marketing, and wise use of Illinois' forages and grasslands. Join today at illinoisforage.org. And now, our speaker.
Welcome, folks, to this webinar. My name's Travis Meteer. I'm going to talk to you all about utilizing corn stalks and crop residues. And in my opinion, it's one of those production strategies and management strategies that's certainly a no-brainer. My contact information is available here on this slide and will be on the final slide if you have questions. But hopefully we bring some tips and some information to you today that you can use and incorporate on your operation to make it not only more profitable for you, but also maybe a little less headache too, as we look at some of our management strategies out there. So today, as far as cornstalk grazing goes, we're going to focus more on the grazing component than maybe harvested cornstalks, but certainly that's an option. We know that corn crop residue is abundant. It's ubiquitous as you travel the Midwest, and especially here in the state of Illinois, we know that corn stalks are maybe an underutilized resource for cattle producers. Through different research projects and trials done at the university, we know that we can support adequate performance with corn stalks as a base. And then in a grazing setting, we can really maintain mature beef cows on not a whole lot more than a mineral supplement in corn stalks. If we get into maybe some of our younger animals or lactating animals, we have supplements available like corn co-products that pair very well with corn stalks here. So we know that we can utilize corn stalks as a base forage for beef cattle in our production system. We also know one of the big main benefits is that it helps control cost. And so as we look at the sustainability and profitability of a beef cow-calf enterprise, grazing corn stalks continues to be one of those strategies that our high return producers are utilizing to the fullest. And then if we have landowners or row crop farmers that are looking to incorporate livestock, there's some management considerations that I think you'll want to hear to make sure that we are benefiting that row cropper. If we're a diversified farmer and we're utilizing livestock on those row crops, there's a few things that we have to manage. But as a trend in the industry, we're seeing more folks want to put livestock on row crop acres and have that livestock incorporation. There's no better way to do that than with a ruminant beef cow. So like I said, corn stalks are everywhere. So a quick fun fact or tip or statistic here is that in 2019, Illinois harvested 10.2 million acres of corn. And Illinois usually is between 11 and 12% of the total harvested acres in the entire United States. So again, we know that corn stalks are an underutilized resource for our cattle producer, and hopefully this presentation can help entice a few more of you to utilize corn stalks in your beef cow-calf enterprise, or potentially even as a base forage for some stocker and grower calves. One of the most popular questions that I get is, how many acres do I need? Most of our producers are probably in a set stock environment where we've either got fencing or temporary fencing around a corn stalk field and water on site. And we need to know, how many acres do I need to fence off, or how many cows can I put on that acreage? In this example, I just used 150 bushel corn yield. We know that there's several acres in Illinois that are going to out yield that figure. And so this is maybe a bit conservative for some of our growers, but using that 150 bushel per acre yield, we know that there's about 2,162 pounds of leaf and husk available for those cows to consume as feed and fodder. Now our target is to harvest half of that, because we know some of it's going to get trampled, some of it will weather and break down, and there'll be some loss. And ultimately we'll want to leave something out there, but we're only talking about the leaf and husk. Remind yourself that there are other components of the corn stalk, like the actual stalk of the plant, and the cob that really the cows don't select for. They don't eat much of the stalk and the cob. They predominantly go after the remaining corn grain that's out there and then consume the leaf and husk. So using these budget figures, we know there's about a little over 1,000 pounds of feed and fodder available to those animals, and that can be readily consumed by those animals, and still leaving plenty of residue to contribute to our organic matter levels and keep that soil covered. So on the flip side of things, on the cow side or the animal side, we know a 1,300 pound cow consumes about 884 pounds of dry matter per month, and that's roughly 30 pounds of dry matter per day. So at that, using that 150 bushel per acre corn yield, we're going to need just less than 1 acre of corn stalks to feed that cow for about 30 days. Now, if we wanted to maybe budget for a longer time frame, or maybe up to 2 months of grazing and keeping those cows out on a corn stalk area, we would need 1.5 acres to 2 acres to host that cow for that period of time. Now, if we've got mature beef cows, like I said, not much supplements needed. If we're looking at fall calving cows or maybe some stock or grower calves, we can utilize some supplementation. And it can be simply something as additional corn grain, or our corn co-products like corn gluten feed and dried distillers grains do pair very well with corn stalk and corn stalk residue. So think about that. Hopefully these numbers give you some budget figures, and maybe if you're thinking about some permanent fencing around corn stalks, this can maybe help you understand what area you may need to fence off to annually utilize this in a grazing scenario. Some big considerations, and this just builds on the conversation of questions and concerns that I get from landowners and then operators about corn stalk grazing. First and foremost, if we're going to utilize corn stalks, grazing them is the best way to do that. So harvesting corn stalks in the baled form definitely can be utilized for a base forage for our beef cows. Just remember that we're probably removing somewhere around $10 a bale in terms of nutrients. The costs associated with baling that forage, transporting those bales, all those things add up, versus if we're just to allow cows to harvest their own feed in a grazing scenario, we can really keep those costs in check. And because cows selectively graze, first the corn, then the husk, then the leaf, they're removing the most nutritious parts of the plant and still leaving that majority of the stalk, the cob, and some of those less desirable parts on the field to cover that soil. And so it's kind of the cow does the best job of harvesting a corn stalk. We always make sure that producers are scouting for down corn and eardrop. That's one big thing. That can be a game changer when we're grazing corn stalks. If we do have areas that are excessive in terms of eardrop, we want to make sure that we know that when the operator is running the combine through the cornfield, we need to make sure and note those areas, because cows will consume that first. And we could have some situations where cows would consume too much corn and potentially have some health problems, acidosis, bloat issues. So it's paramount that we know where areas of down corn or excessive eardrop may be, so that we don't cause health issues to our cows. Nitrates is another thing that I get questions about very frequently. And in a grazing scenario, usually nitrates are not much of a concern. One of the big reasons is because nitrates predominantly accumulate in the stalk of the plant and more or less in the bottom third of the stalk. And so as I mentioned before, cows really select corn, husk, and leaf. So they're not much enticed to consume the stalk component where the nitrates would be highest. So generally in a grazing scenario, we don't have much problems with nitrates. If we are harvesting corn stalks in the baled form and we're allowing cows to eat those bales, or especially if we're grinding them and incorporating them into a TMR or total mixed ration, we would suggest that you go ahead and get a bale core done, get a nitrates level on those high-risk fields to make sure that we're not incorporating a higher level of nitrates into our cow ration than we would suggest. And if you have concerns about that, you get feed tests, nutrient analysis back, you can always share those with me or your local extension specialist, and they can help you interpret those results. Something else that can impact how long we can graze corn stalks would first be the weather. If it's wet, we know that cows are going to trample more. More moisture also accelerates the breakdown of that corn stalk. And then here recently, we've got a lot of technology that's helping us size residue and break it down. And that's good in terms of getting that residue to break down before the next crop. It's also getting the residue to break down quicker than maybe sometimes our cows can consume it. And so I would just be, I've had several conversations with folks that, may have mowers or kind of some kind of residue sizing attachment. And in those situations where we know we're going to graze a corn stalk field, we may need to hold off on those attachments and those management practices to allow that residue to be around long enough in the Midwest for those cows to consume. Another consideration would be use your healthy fields. So we know we've seen some corn stalk fields with leaf diseases. We know that'll negatively impact the palatability of those plant components. And so if you have healthier fields than others, those may be better suited for grazing or harvesting as baled corn stalks. Also monitor cow behavior. There's no substitute for good stockmanship. And so making sure that cows are full, they're satisfied, and that their manure looks good is a big part of knowing when we've ran out of corn stalk grazing or when we still have good corn stalk grazing ahead of us. Supplement may be needed for those 2-year-olds, fall calvers, and stalker calves, as I mentioned. So a good extension specialist can't go through a presentation without showing you some data. And so this is actually some research that was done at Dudley Smith Farm, located in Pana, Illinois, a few years back. It just shows different stocking rates. These cows were strip grazed, but mature beef cows weighing mid 12s. Actually, we supplemented these cows with some distiller's grains, and you can see that these cows did gain weight. And so with a low level of supplement and a good corn stalk grazing season, our mature beef cows will actually gain weight on corn stalks. And so I think that's something that producers need to know is as we compare this to other feeding strategies, just know that our corn stalk grazing can be just as good for animal performance as some of maybe our harvested feeds. And here's where corn stalk grazing really shines. When we start putting the pencil to the paper and just adding up the cost of corn stalk grazing, you can see here at the bottom line, we're at somewhere between 50 and 60 cents per head per day on grazing corn stalks. And again, this number will vary depending on what your costs are per acre and your supplement costs, but these costs would be very comparable to what many Illinois cattle producers would be seeing here this year. And you can see as we compare these costs to delivering hay or a TMR to a cow, well, we're beating that number by at least $1 in most situations. So anytime we're using harvested feeds and hays and delivering that to a cow in our wintering facilities, a lot of times that number looks more like $2 a day. And so to save very close to $1.50 per head per day by utilizing corn stalks, that's why you can see quickly why a lot of our high return producers utilize corn stalk grazing to the fullest to manage that cost side of their operation. Building on some of the early research done at Dudley Smith, we wanted to look a little bit more into not only cow performance, but the behavior, what components those animals select, and then the grazing impacts on our soil and subsequent crop yields. This report is available in its fullest. Just email me. I also published an article in Progressive Forage, the detailed, the outline of this research trial. So that stuff is available on the internet as well, or by contacting me in more detail. I'm just going to talk about some high points on this trial and graze over the take homes of what we found in this research project. So we utilized 36 mature Angus cows. We did have 3 treatments, so a continuous graze treatment, a strip graze treatment, and then some of those paddocks were left ungrazed. The stocking rate that was used in this trial was 1.2 cows per acre. And this diagram kind of shows you the layout, the form, the randomness that we did use, and then the strip grazing paddocks where the water and feed was located. This slide shows cow performance, and again, you can see that we've got positive body weight change on these cows. So these cows are gaining weight. So again, with some mild, low-level supplementation, these cows are gaining weight on corn stalks, both the strip grazed and continuous graze treatments. Some of you may notice that the strip grazed cows gain just a slightly more weight in both years than our continuous grazed cows. I think common sense really tells us that if we partition some of those nutrients out from the corn stalk, we don't have maybe that upfront selectivity where those cows eat all the goodie at the beginning and they get towards the end of the grazing period and don't have as much left. And so strip grazing can help manage that. I think strip grazing is another strategy to kind of help impact the trampling of those components as well. So as cows walk around and seek those best parts, they trample more into the ground. So those are some considerations. Many farmers in the Midwest and especially Illinois are going to have more corn acres than they have cows. And so even if those cows are trampling more, even if those cows are traveling a little more and selecting the best components at the beginning of that grazing period, it may not matter because we have more corn stalks than we have cows. I apologize for this slide being a little blurry, but I stole it right out of the research report, and that's why. One of the big questions that landowners ask is, what about compaction from grazing? And so we looked at this in our Dudley Smith trial, and on the right-hand side, the blue line that goes all the way down to that 2,000 mark is where we would consider an agronomic impact from compaction that would be negative. And as you can see in this trial, all of our measurements from the control, the strip grazing, and the continuous grazing are more or less right there together. And none of them approach that 2,000 mark where we would consider compaction of an agronomic level that would be negative. So to answer the question on compaction, in this trial where we allowed cows to graze 6 weeks and we did not see any problems with soil compaction from grazing, you can see, if anything, the top 10 inches is where you would see a little bit of a difference, and we could remedy that with some light tillage. Conclusions from the Dudley Smith Farm study: grazing did not impact subsequent crop yields. So our subsequent crop yield data for 3 years showed that there was no negative effects, or those yields were similar. That was with a 6-week grazing period. We noticed that cows, as they travel around, they helped incorporate components into the soil, especially the cob. And so we noticed the cows ate predominantly leaf and husk, but there was less cob on top of the soil when we took our measurements at the end of the grazing period. And that's likely that those cows are stepping on it and incorporating it into the soil. Strip grazing, those cows had slightly better weight gains. Again, we're saving some of that, we're reducing the trample, and we're partitioning those nutrients over the grazing period. Again, if we're like most Illinois cattle producers that have row crop operations, we've probably got more corn acres than we do cows. And so in this situation, strip grazing may or may not make sense. One other thing that the authors noted that I think is pretty important is that the high traffic areas around water and feed and those mineral feeders showed a slight yield drag on the yield map. So as you can think about when it rains, where cows stand the most or where they may congregate the most around those water, feed, and mineral, that's where we saw some maybe negative impacts to yield. And in our trial, we didn't move those. The water stayed in the same spot, the feed stayed in the same spot, and the mineral stayed in the same spot. In a scenario where you're rotationally grazing around a corn stalk field, or even in a continuous grazing setting where you can move those water, feed, and mineral around, I don't feel like you would have those same impacts. And so as we manage for the best for the cattle and for the land, we may need to consider moving that water, feed, and mineral around to make sure we don't overtrack an area, especially in those wet years. So to kind of close some thoughts here, corn stalks is a no-brainer. It's a big cost control mechanism for cattle operations. If we can save on feed costs and save those harvested feeds for different periods of time later on in the winter, we know that we can help control costs in our cow-calf operation. We do need to manage stock density in those high traffic areas, especially if we're maybe looking at renting corn stalks. We need to know how many cows to put on there, and then those high traffic areas would be our high risk areas if we do have problems with negative impact from animals. But like I said, following our recommended stock density and following our recommended grazing time frame, we see no subsequent problems with yield or compaction when grazing cattle on corn stalks. And then a point here talking about getting ruminants on row crop land. I really think that we're going to hear more about this in the future. And as we look at more sustainable farming practices, incorporating ruminants onto our tillable land is going to be a big part. And grazing corn stalks may be your gateway to that. As you look down the road, maybe you're interested in cover crops and grazing cover crops with cows. Grazing crop residues is already there. It's something that's pretty easy to do if we can, with the technology we have with geared reels and temporary fence, and even some pretty unique opportunities to deliver water. We can do that with not a lot of effort to get ruminants back on our row crop land. So talk to several young farmers that talk about their grandpa mentioning to them that they spent their whole life taking fences out, and now those young farmers are putting those fences back. And so it's encouraging to see a lot of producers and row crop farmers, diversified farmers in the Midwest are already looking at how we can get ruminant animals back on the land. And then something that I would just throw out there that I talk in my conversations with producers is this really is farming with synergy. And synergy is just when you add two things together, you get a greater end than the two parts separate. So I think if we incorporate cows in a corn stalk grazing scenario, we look down the road, probably at cover crops as an option, there is a lot of synergy that exists with having cows on our land, utilizing those byproducts from our row crop operation. So with that, I'll kind of end this discussion. I appreciate your time, your attentiveness, and my contact information is there. If you're interested in any of those full research reports or want to expand the conversation into something that maybe is more suited to your operation, I'm always glad to do that. So thank you for your time and your attention.